friends. It's a delight to be here with Dr. Mona Fishbane, a clinical psychologist licensed in Illinois and New Jersey, who is the past director of the couple therapy training program at the Chicago Center for Family Health. She's the author of the book, Loving with the Brain in Mind, Neurobiology and Couple Therapy, published by Norton in 2013, and has written numerous articles and book chapters, and has consulted with rabbis on retreat, spoken in synagogues, and written for the journal Shema on the overlap between Jewish values and wisdom from neurobiology and psychology. In 2017, she was named Family Psychologist of the Year by the American Psychological Association Division 43. Dr. Fishbane, thanks so much for taking time to talk.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Shmuly.
Thank you. So it makes sense. This is so exciting. And can you tell us what in your experiences led you to write this?
Sure. So I've been practicing couple therapy for many years. I first went to graduate school in the early 70s. I grew up with the field of couple and family therapy. And in 2004, I discovered neurobiology. I went to a retreat to learn neurobiology, and I just totally fell in love with neuroscience. And I started writing articles on integrating that with couple and family therapy. And then in 2009, the publisher Norton asked me to write a book, which became that book. It's part of the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology. So that's really been my passion ever since. And that's where the book comes from, and where I'm still very much passionate about.
So, when I think of neurobiology and the brain, I think determinism. And when I think of Judaism, I think teshuvah. I think change. And when I think of relationships, I think of the stability and the evolution together. Correct. So how do we think about determinism and teshuvah? And in particular, the question, as individuals and in couples, can we change?
Great question. You cut right to the heart of the matter. I'm a therapist, and therapists are in the business of change. That's what we do. But then people resist, quote unquote. They don't go with our little plans for change. Do you remember being in college and we debated nature versus nurture? I don't know if you did in your day, but in my day, we certainly did.
Of course.
And it turns out that neuroscience has actually resolved that debate. It's both and.
Right.
So we're born with genetic predispositions and temperaments, which then affect, our relationships, but relationships nurture very much change the brain. The baby's brain is born wired to connect, ready to be connected by how the parents and caregivers treat the baby. Baby has a lot of neurons, but not a lot of connected neurons. And it's the circuits of neurons in our brain that sort of indicate who we are and how we behave. So depending on how you're raised, plus your genetic predisposition, the two come together. And we now know that experience not only wires the circuits of neurons, but it also changes your epigenetics, which is how your genes are expressed. So it's very exciting, the research, right? Which is it really, really, really matters what environment you're raised in and how you live your whole life. So let's come to the question of, can you change as an adult, right? So there's a term called neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change. And the research shows that the child's brain is extremely plastic, i.e. changeable. The baby's born ready to be shaped by culture and by family, et cetera. We used to think, or scientists used to think, that after age 25, your brain was fully wired and it was all downhill from there as you lost neurons as you age. And it is true that we lose neurons as we age. But that's not a sentence necessarily. We can actually, depending on how we live, we can actually keep our neurons quite vital. But it turns out now that research, really spearheaded by Eric Kandel, who wrote an amazing book called In Search of Memory and won the Nobel Prize for his work, he showed that neuroplasticity can continue. He showed first that learning changes the brain. So everything we do changes our brain. And he also showed that neuroplasticity can continue into adulthood, which is what a lot of research has shown, which is the hopeful sign. So the question is, can old dogs learn new tricks? And can a zebra change its stripes? And the answer is old dogs can learn new tricks, but it takes a lot of work in adulthood for us humans to change, a lot of motivation and practice for us to change our wiring and our habits. And with regard to the zebras, there are certain limitations based on our temperament and our genetic limitations, but we really can make a lot of changes in adulthood, which is a very hopeful, I think, finding in terms of what the field of neuroscience teaches us.
So we oftentimes talk about change as being cognitive, being behavioral, being affective. What's the real entry point? when we talk about getting in there for that, and there's that plasticity, there's that potential to really evolve. What is that primary entry point? Of course, there's never just one in
Right.
terms of how we can create lasting change.
I think it's definitely all three. You've nailed all three, right? It's how we behave, it's how we think, what are our narratives, and how we feel. And they're all intertwined. So if I have a narrative, that my partner is selfish, it's going to fuel my anger. It's going to fuel my self-protection or my blame, right? If my narrative is that I love, by the way, today's my anniversary.
Oh, mazel tov.
My husband's and my anniversary. We've been together a very long time. And I lucked out. I got a great guy. You know him. And so, we're still evolving. We're still growing. We've been home together during the pandemic, and we're growing together during the pandemic. So I feel very blessed to continue to evolve with him. But it's definitely all three. And the other thing is that we shape each other's brain and each other's identity. Yes. How we behave with our partner has ethical implications for our partner's own well-being, body and soul. Yeah. Cognitive and emotional.
On the first point around nature, nurture, and all that, the way I saw it most was when foster children enter our home. The foster child will clearly never be similar to our biological children in some ways. And in other ways, only in days and in weeks, they have radically changed, not just physically in terms of their nourishment, but in terms of their speech and their other capabilities. Now, picking up on this
last point. Before you go, I just want to say how much I admire you for doing that. I mean, I've been tracking your work and your generosity of spirit, Shmuly. It's amazing what you and your wife do.
We gain far more than we give through that and any other endeavor. We're very fortunate, but thank you. So on this point about relationships, talk to me about interdependence. We tend to celebrate in America independence. I built myself. Yes. I am my own person. And even go to individuals therapy rather than couples therapy. And they're like, right. How do we understand on the neurobiological level this notion of interdependence?
Well, you've nailed it again. I mean, you're hitting all the hot spots, all the key points for me, which I really appreciate. So the United States, the dominant culture in the United States, the mythic hero is the cowboy, the rugged individualist. And for a long time, psychotherapists and psychoanalysts have fed that notion that you've got to grow up and be autonomous and, put dependence behind you. We now know that that's not true. We now know, and this is based on really solid research, that we are interdependent throughout life. We need others throughout life. There's a field called psychoneuroimmunology, which looks at the relationship between your mind, your brain, and your immune system and your social life, right? And it's very clear that a rich social life and a good support system makes a huge difference in terms of your well-being. So but the problem is that many couples take in this myth of individualism and then they get into power struggles. You can't tell me what to do. You're calling me selfish. You don't understand me. I'm not going to let you boss me around. And of course, in heterosexual couples, there's some gender politics that go on there. I think it's very damaging. I really do. Much of the rest of the world is not as tied to this fetish of individualism. What we now know in this pandemic is that we are all intertwined. As we say in Hebrew, Kol Yisrael Arivim Zabazeh, humanity is intertwined. We're intervulnerable, interdependent, and we need to be interresponsible. So I'm really interested in the ways in which in a couple relationship, couples need to be taking care of each other. And there's, we have fight or flight, right? Your amygdala detects danger and you go to fight or flight, you protect yourself. But we also have tend and befriend. This comes from Shelley Taylor's work. She's a psychoneuroimmunologist at UCLA. We're wired to take care of each other, which I think is really incredible, right? We're wired to be compassionate. There's a lot of research on this, a lot of writing on this, which I really have brought forward in my book and in my other writing and my teaching. So I feel like I want to just share one quick little vignette with you from Thich Nhat Hanh, one of my favorite people. He's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And he says that we all have inside ourselves seeds of love and compassion. And we also have seeds of anger and resentment. And the seeds that we water and nurture are the ones that will grow. So he says, water your seeds of love and compassion, not your seeds of anger and resentment. And water your partner's seeds of love and compassion also. So I feel like that's really important. We have choice. That's the other thing I want to just say is that we have an automatic brain that goes on automatic pilot a lot of the time. That's our emotional brain, our habits, right? But we have a higher brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is behind your forehead, that allows us to regulate our emotional brain. And we do have choice. You know, Viktor Frankl famously said, between stimulus and response is a space. In that space is our freedom to choose. So a lot of my work with couples, and a lot of my work in my own life, frankly, is pausing and finding that space where I can make a choice. Is the way I'm about to behave in keeping with my higher values, with who I want to be in this relationship? What impact will it have on my husband if I act in this way versus that way? And what impact will it have on our relationship? So we do have choice.
Yeah, very different than an orientation of entitlement. Am I
Yes.
getting out more than I'm putting
Exactly.
in?
Right.
As opposed to intercare. Yeah.
The dominant, again, one of the dominant U.S. values is my rights.
Right,
I
exactly.
mean, you see it now, people are marching in the streets for their rights, even if it means somebody else dies because of their behavior. Judaism talks about responsibility and obligation, and so do many traditional cultures around the world. And I think it's both. I don't think we have to throw away rights, right? Individual rights. But it's not either or. And I think if we don't attend enough to the responsibility part of this, we really are falling short in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So, we've been talking mostly about couples so far. Well, let's talk briefly about intergenerational
Sure.
relationships.
That's where it all starts, right?
Right. I mean, we can dissolve a partner relationship. I mean,
Right.
hopefully we don't have to, but we have
Right.
that ability to do that. And the truth is, we can dissolve a relationship with a parent as well on a communicative level, but never on a biological level. And so, how do we think about kibud avim, honoring mothers and fathers, in regards to the implications it has for us long term? The way we think about our parents, the way, and as they're aging, the way we behave towards them, and the implications that has for us and our own well-being long term.
So it's a great question. That's my other passion, is intergenerational relationships. I've lived it. I lived it with my parents. They died some years ago, but for 13 years, they were in assisted living near me, and I was their main person. And also professionally. So I think that when we have unfinished business or old grievances with our parents or our siblings, mostly our parents, it definitely negatively affects us in our current life. We get triggered in the ways, let's say our partner is critical, and our mother was critical, or our father was critical, and then we get triggered all over again. One of my main teachers in the intergenerational literature is Ivan Bojar-Meninaj. He's no longer living, but he was a Hungarian family therapist who was very influenced by Martin Buber, as I was. I think that Naj could have been a Jewish mother, except he wasn't a woman or Jewish, but he had those values. And he says, when we carry this chip on our shoulder, we look to collect damages, but at the wrong address. Uh-huh. So we try to collect them, not consciously, but sort of unconsciously, from our spouse or our partner or our children, right? So a woman who was very angry at her father for not being around when she was a kid, has a baby, all her wounds are healed because the baby adores her. It's all great. Then the boy becomes an adolescent and does what adolescents do, which is he turns away from her, and then she goes nuts on him, right? Because she's been collecting damages from her son to make up for her father wound. So if we don't work on our issues with our family of origin, we will take it out inadvertently on our spouse or our children. The stories we tell about our parents are often very old, very frozen in childhood. We don't necessarily know the backstory. I mean, one of the privileges, my mother died at 98, and one of the privileges for me was getting to know her story more and more as she aged and I aged. And fleshing out that story really helped me understand her in a much more sympathetic way. I always loved my mother, but it was really helpful to know the backstory. Also, our parents may, once we left home, they may have, grown a bit and softened a bit, and we're still holding on to this view of them, from childhood. The other thing is that many of us are still what I call living under the spell of childhood, right? We are waiting for our parents to wake up and give us what we want, which of course, disempowers us and makes that relationship very fraught. So I like to talk about waking from the spell of childhood and coming to see our parents as real people who have their own life journey, their own vulnerabilities, their own ways of protecting themselves like we do, and trying to be a little more sympathetic, trying to bring what the Jewish tradition calls kav sechut, which is the kind of benefit of the doubt, looking at them with a positive eye as opposed to just a negative eye, and seeing parents as real people. One of my favorite quotes in family therapy comes from Michael Kerr, who says, think of your mother as your grandmother's daughter and get to know her that way. And of course, that would also be true of your father or your grandfather. So that we try to imagine our parents as people who were on their own life journey. And that often creates, I think, more compassion. I also think a lot about how we update our relationships with our parents and siblings so we're not stuck in the past, not stuck in that child's view. So that's just a little taste kind of what I think about.
Amazing. Wow. Amazing. So just one last question today, unless there's anything else you want to add,
Sure.
which is picking up on this last point you brought in of being done l'chafzchut, of judging more charitably. And I wonder, going beyond the home and the family,
Right.
It seems like now, perhaps more than ever, we're in a society that is divisive,
Right.
and where there's a lot of anger, sometimes well-placed, sometimes misplaced. And I wonder how we condition ourselves spiritually, affectively, each day to go out into the world and holding that space a little bit more gently. How do we judge a little bit less harshly,
Right.
as we understand each other's motives in what they're trying to achieve around us?
Right. I think that's a great question. I think that one of the things we need to know is that when we feel threatened, our amygdala, which is always looking for safety versus danger, and when it experiences threat, it triggers the fight or flight response. And the amygdala is always biased towards the negative, which is for survival purposes. It's good for us, right? Because you see a wild animal in the forest and you run, right? You don't just sit around, talking to the animal or getting between a mother bear and her cubs or whatever. On the other hand, you don't judge the mother bear for being bad, right? Mother bear is doing what she needs to do to protect her cubs. So we have to train ourselves to look for the positive, to cultivate positivity. I think, again, the Buddhist meditation tradition has a lot of wonderful ways of doing that in terms of the metta meditation, loving kindness meditation. I think Kafsachut, I just read that in I'm doing Daf Yomi, which I love. And I just read that a few weeks ago or a few days ago in Daf Yomi, the Kafsachut. So I think that it's something we need to train. It's not natural for us to do Kafsachut. We really have to train ourselves for it. And it's hard to do it in the current environment where people are so divided with each other.
So who is this for? Is this more for a practitioner, someone intellectually curious? Is this for someone looking for their own healing or looking for their own tools?
It's both. As I write in the beginning of the book, writers have their reader in mind. In the old days they would say gentle reader.
Mm-hmm.
So I had my reader in mind, and it's certainly for therapists of all stages, but it's also for lay people who are interested, who are curious about relationships and how to make their relationships better, and also curious about what the brain has to do with it all. And it's not. I work really hard to make it accessible. To not have people have their eyes glaze over when they read it. It's not highly technical. I did a ton of reading of research, so it's based solidly on research, but I tried to make it very readable. And I have one case going through the book, Eric and Lisa, so they're a composite case that I somewhat made up and somewhat took pieces from my own life or clients or whatever. So I think that I wrote it so that it would be compelling for an intelligent, curious layperson as well as therapists.
Amazing. Friends, I can't recommend highly enough that Dr. Fishbane is someone rooted in the academic and empirical world, in the practitioner and the experiential world, but also in living Jewish learning and values, and with deep Menschlichkeit. So please be sure to check this out. Thank you, Dr. Fishbane, for your time.
Thank you so much. Be well.